During my decades working in British public hospitals and prisons, I witnessed something that defied every compassionate instinct of liberal society: the systematic destruction of human dignity by the very welfare state designed to preserve it. Day after day, I observed how policies crafted with the noblest intentions, to eliminate poverty, to provide security, to show compassion for the unfortunate, had transformed into a machinery of spiritual impoverishment that trapped generations in cycles of dependency, violence, and despair. The patients who entered my consultation room weren't victims of material deprivation in any traditional sense. They had housing, healthcare, and income without work. Yet they exhibited levels of hopelessness, rage, and self-destruction that would have seemed impossible to reformers who first envisioned the welfare state. What I discovered through direct clinical observation was a paradox that our intellectual class refuses to acknowledge: that unconditional material provision, far from liberating human potential, had created a new form of bondage more psychologically devastating than the poverty it replaced. This isn't a story about economics or statistics. It's about what happens to the human soul when society removes the fundamental connection between effort and reward, responsibility and consequence. Through thousands of individual cases, I watched the welfare trap operate with mechanical precision, destroying lives with the efficiency that only bureaucratic compassion can achieve. Chapter 1: The Laboratory of Good Intentions. The prison hospital where I worked for years served as an unwitting laboratory for observing the long-term effects of welfare dependency. Unlike academic theorists who study poverty from university offices, I met its alleged beneficiaries daily: young men whose entire lives had been shaped by the assumption that society owed them sustenance without contribution. The pattern was so consistent it became predictable. A typical patient would be a third-generation welfare recipient, raised by a single mother who herself had never worked, living in subsidized housing in communities where legitimate employment was as rare as stable marriages. These young men possessed an intimate knowledge of welfare regulations that would impress any bureaucrat, yet remained functionally illiterate in skills that might lead to genuine independence. What struck me most profoundly was not their material circumstances, which were often superior to those of working-class families I'd known in previous generations, but their complete inability to conceive of life as anything other than an endless struggle for immediate gratification against an allegedly hostile system. The welfare state had succeeded brilliantly in eliminating material want while simultaneously destroying every character trait necessary for human flourishing: patience, planning, persistence, and personal responsibility. During one memorable consultation, a 19-year-old patient explained to me with perfect sincerity that he couldn't understand why he should work when the government pays me to stay home. He wasn't being cynical or manipulative. He genuinely couldn't comprehend why anyone would choose the uncertainty and effort of employment over the security of benefits. The welfare system had so thoroughly removed the connection between effort and reward that the very concept of earning one's living had become incomprehensible. This wasn't laziness in any traditional sense. These patients often expended enormous energy on complex schemes to maximize their benefits, navigate bureaucratic requirements, and manage the chaos that welfare dependency inevitably creates in personal relationships. They possessed a kind of intelligence, but it was an intelligence entirely directed toward gaming a system that rewarded dysfunction and penalized improvement. The psychological impact was devastating. When society provides material support without requiring contribution, it inadvertently communicates that the recipient is fundamentally incapable of productive contribution. The message received isn't, "We care about you," but rather, "We don't expect anything from you because you're not capable of anything worthwhile." This learned helplessness, reinforced by institutional structures, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroys human dignity more thoroughly than material poverty ever could. Chapter 2: The Culture of Therapeutic Victimhood. What emerged from the welfare state wasn't merely economic dependency but an entire culture that transformed personal problems into societal grievances and individual responsibility into collective guilt. During my years treating patients in this system, I observed how the therapeutic language of social work and psychology had been weaponized to justify every form of destructive behavior. The vocabulary was revealing and consistent. Patients never chose destructive behaviors, they were driven to them by circumstances beyond their control. They didn't make mistakes, they were victims of social forces, family dysfunction, or historical injustices. Criminal behavior wasn't the result of moral choices but rather acting out against oppression or self-medicating psychological pain. This linguistic transformation wasn't accidental. It served the essential function of preserving the welfare recipient's psychological dependence on the system. I recall a young mother who had produced 3 children by 3 different fathers, none of whom contributed to their support. When I suggested that her choices might have contributed to her circumstances, she responded with therapeutic jargon that would have impressed any social work professor. Her behavior was trauma-informed because of her own adverse childhood experiences. The welfare system had provided her not only with housing and income but with a complete ideological framework that transformed every poor decision into evidence of society's failure rather than her own. This therapeutic culture created a peculiar form of narcissism disguised as victim consciousness. Every welfare recipient I encountered possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of their rights but remained entirely ignorant of any corresponding obligations. They could recite chapter and verse of discrimination law while remaining incapable of basic social courtesies. They demanded services with an entitlement that would have embarrassed medieval nobility while contributing nothing to the common good. The psychological effects were predictable and devastating. When society teaches people that their problems are always someone else's responsibility, it destroys their capacity for self-improvement. When every poor outcome is attributed to external forces, individuals lose the ability to learn from experience. When therapeutic language replaces moral language, people lose the conceptual framework necessary for genuine personal growth. Most tragically, this culture of therapeutic victimhood created a perverse incentive structure where improvement was actually punished. Patients who demonstrated personal growth, acquired job skills, or stabilized their relationships risked losing benefits. The system rewarded continued dysfunction while penalizing progress, creating a psychological prison more confining than any physical institution. The welfare state had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. It had created a class of people who were simultaneously materially provided for and spiritually impoverished, economically secure and psychologically destroyed, legally protected and morally abandoned. Chapter 3: The Destruction of Future Orientation. One of the most devastating effects I observed among long-term welfare recipients was the complete loss of what psychologists call future orientation, the ability to delay gratification, plan ahead, and connect present actions with future consequences. This wasn't a character flaw but rather a predictable adaptation to a system that made planning both unnecessary and impossible. Consider the logic of welfare dependency from the recipient's perspective. The system guarantees income regardless of behavior, provides housing without regard to personal conduct, and offers services without demanding improvement. Under these circumstances, developing the capacity for long-term thinking becomes not just unnecessary but actually counterproductive. Why plan for tomorrow when tomorrow is guaranteed to be exactly like today? I witnessed this psychological transformation in countless patients who had lost the ability to conceive of their lives as narratives with beginning, middle, and end. Instead, they experienced existence as an endless series of immediate crises requiring immediate intervention. Every day brought fresh emergencies, unpaid bills despite regular income, housing problems despite subsidized accommodation, relationship drama despite endless therapeutic support. The most heartbreaking cases were young people who had never experienced the satisfaction of earning something through their own efforts. I remember an 18-year-old patient who had never held a job, never saved money for a purchase, never experienced the pride of accomplishment that comes from overcoming difficulty through persistence. When I suggested that work might provide satisfaction beyond mere income, he looked at me with genuine incomprehension. The concept of deriving meaning from contribution was as foreign to him as speaking Mandarin. This destruction of future orientation had profound consequences for every aspect of life. Relationships became impossible to maintain because they require the ability to work through temporary difficulties for long-term benefits. Education became meaningless because it demands present sacrifice for future advantage. Even simple household management became impossible because it requires connecting today's decisions with tomorrow's consequences. The welfare system had created a peculiar form of temporal prison where recipients lived in an eternal present, unable to learn from the past or plan for the future. Every problem required immediate external intervention because the psychological tools for gradual self-improvement had been systematically destroyed. What emerged was a dependency more complete than traditional poverty had ever achieved. Historical poor people retained the capacity for aspiration, the ability to imagine better circumstances through their own efforts. Welfare recipients had been robbed of even this fundamental human capacity. They could imagine better circumstances, but only through the intervention of others, more services, better housing, increased benefits. The idea that they might improve their own circumstances through personal effort had become literally unthinkable. Chapter 4: The Sentimentalism That Kills. Perhaps nothing revealed the destructive nature of welfare dependency more clearly than observing how middle-class professionals, social workers, therapists, administrators, related to their clients. What I witnessed wasn't genuine compassion but rather a form of sentimentalism that treated welfare recipients as objects of pity rather than subjects capable of moral agency and personal growth. This sentimentalism was most evident in how these professionals responded to destructive behavior. When a welfare mother allowed her boyfriend to abuse her children, the response wasn't moral outrage but therapeutic understanding. When a young man committed crimes against his neighbors, the focus wasn't on justice for victims but on addressing the perpetrator's underlying issues. When recipients engaged in obviously self-destructive behaviors, professionals searched for root causes in social conditions rather than confronting the simple reality of poor choices. The language used was revealing. Clients were never described as making bad decisions, but rather as struggling with challenges. They weren't irresponsible, but disadvantaged. They didn't need discipline, but support. This linguistic transformation served to remove moral agency from the very people who most desperately needed to reclaim it. I observed how this sentimentalism created a peculiar form of racism disguised as compassion. The same middle-class professionals who expected their own children to behave responsibly, work hard, and face consequences for poor choices applied entirely different standards to welfare recipients. The implicit message was clear: these people aren't capable of the moral expectations we apply to ourselves. The practical consequences were devastating. When society refuses to hold people accountable for their behavior, it inadvertently communicates that they're incapable of improvement. When every destructive choice is met with increased services rather than decreased support, it creates a perverse incentive structure that rewards dysfunction. When therapeutic language replaces moral language, people lose the conceptual framework necessary for genuine change. Most tragically, this sentimentalism prevented welfare recipients from experiencing the dignity that comes from being held to high standards. I witnessed countless cases where individuals were capable of far more than the system expected from them, but the low expectations became self-fulfilling prophecies. The welfare state had created a form of soft bigotry that was more psychologically destructive than old-fashioned prejudice because it was disguised as kindness. The professionals themselves became trapped in this system of therapeutic delusion. They couldn't acknowledge the failure of their interventions without confronting the fundamental contradictions of their worldview. So they doubled down on failed approaches, increasing services for people who needed expectations, providing therapy for people who needed consequences, offering understanding for people who needed judgment. This sentimentalism represented the peculiar cruelty of liberal compassion, a compassion so focused on avoiding immediate discomfort that it guaranteed long-term suffering. Chapter 5: The Language of Bureaucratic Control. During my years working within the welfare system, I became fascinated by how language was systematically corrupted to obscure rather than illuminate reality. The bureaucratic vocabulary surrounding welfare wasn't neutral. It was carefully crafted to prevent honest assessment of what was actually happening to human beings trapped within the system. Consider how problems were redefined through therapeutic jargon. Drug addiction became substance use disorder, removing any suggestion of moral choice or personal responsibility. Criminal behavior became antisocial behavior, suggesting a medical condition rather than deliberate wrongdoing. Promiscuity became relationship challenges, transforming destructive choices into therapeutic opportunities. This linguistic transformation wasn't accidental. It served the essential function of maintaining the fiction that welfare recipients were patients rather than moral agents. The most revealing example was how the word client replaced patient in social services. Patients are people with genuine medical conditions who seek treatment with the goal of recovery. Clients are customers in a permanent relationship with service providers. This linguistic shift reflected the reality that welfare had become a permanent condition rather than temporary assistance. But the language obscured this transformation by making it sound more dignified. I observed how this corrupted language infected the thinking of everyone involved in the system. Social workers couldn't identify obvious solutions to clients' problems because the approved vocabulary prevented accurate diagnosis. When a young woman's repeated pregnancies by different men were creating chaos in her life, discussing personal responsibility became impossible because the therapeutic framework only permitted conversations about reproductive choices and family planning challenges. The language also served to expand the welfare system's reach by pathologizing normal human experiences. Grief became depression requiring intervention. Ordinary adolescent rebellion became conduct disorder needing treatment. Consequences of poor choices became adverse outcomes requiring services. Every human difficulty was transformed into a justification for professional intervention and continued dependency. Most insidiously, this linguistic manipulation prevented welfare recipients themselves from thinking clearly about their situations. When they adopted therapeutic language to describe their experiences, they lost the ability to see patterns in their own behavior or make connections between choices and consequences. A young man who described his criminal behavior as acting out due to trauma couldn't learn from experience because the language prevented him from seeing his actions as deliberate choices. The corruption of language also served to silence critics of the system. Anyone who suggested that welfare recipients might bear responsibility for their circumstances was accused of blaming the victim. Anyone who questioned whether unlimited services actually helped people was labeled lacking compassion. The therapeutic vocabulary had become a form of thought control that made honest evaluation impossible. This linguistic manipulation represented something more profound than mere political correctness. It was the systematic destruction of the conceptual tools necessary for moral reasoning and personal growth. Chapter 6: The Moral Relativism Trap. One of the most psychologically destructive aspects of the welfare system was how it promoted moral relativism as official policy. During my years treating welfare recipients, I observed how the absence of clear moral standards created a psychological chaos that was far more damaging than material poverty. The system's commitment to non-judgmental service delivery sounds compassionate in theory but proves devastating in practice. When professionals are prohibited from making moral distinctions between responsible and irresponsible behavior, they inadvertently communicate that all choices are equally valid. This might seem liberating, but it actually creates a form of moral vertigo that makes healthy psychological functioning impossible. I recall a young mother who had lost custody of her children due to neglect. During our sessions, she expressed genuine confusion about why her children had been removed. The social services team had been so committed to avoiding judgment that they had never clearly explained that leaving toddlers unattended while she went drinking was morally wrong, not just technically inappropriate. Their therapeutic approach had focused on her parenting challenges and stress management issues, rather than the simple reality that her behavior was harmful to helpless children. This moral relativism created a peculiar form of cruelty disguised as tolerance. When society refuses to distinguish between right and wrong, it abandons people to moral confusion at precisely the moment they most need guidance. The welfare recipients I treated weren't liberated by the absence of moral standards, they were tormented by it. Human beings require moral frameworks to function psychologically, and when society fails to provide them, individuals must create their own, often with destructive results. The practical consequences were evident in every aspect of welfare recipients' lives. Without clear standards for acceptable behavior, relationships became impossible to maintain. Without moral frameworks for decision-making, every choice became equally arbitrary. Without the satisfaction that comes from meeting high expectations, life became meaningless and depression inevitable. Most tragically, this moral relativism prevented welfare recipients from experiencing the dignity that comes from moral achievement. When society communicates that it expects nothing from you, it simultaneously communicates that you're capable of nothing worthwhile. The welfare system's refusal to impose moral standards was actually a profound expression of contempt disguised as compassion. I observed how this moral confusion was particularly devastating for young people who had never experienced clear boundaries or high expectations. They exhibited a kind of moral hunger, a desperate desire for someone to tell them definitively what was right and wrong. The welfare system's commitment to relativism left them psychologically starving for the moral nutrition that healthy human development requires. The irony was that the same middle-class professionals who promoted moral relativism for welfare recipients maintained strict moral standards in their own lives. They expected their own children to work hard, treat others with respect, and face consequences for poor choices. The relativism was specifically prescribed for the underclass, creating a form of moral apartheid more corrosive than traditional discrimination. Chapter 7. Breaking free from the compassion trap. After decades of observing the destructive effects of welfare dependency, I began to understand that genuine compassion requires the courage to impose high expectations and accept the possibility of failure. The welfare recipients who achieved genuine improvement weren't those who received the most services, but those who encountered someone willing to treat them as capable moral agents rather than permanent victims. The key insight from my clinical experience was that human dignity depends not on what others provide for you but on what you provide for others. The welfare system had systematically removed opportunities for recipients to contribute, serve, or sacrifice for worthy causes. This wasn't merely an economic problem but a spiritual catastrophe that destroyed the foundation of human self-worth. I remember one patient who began to improve only when a local church demanded that he contribute volunteer labor in exchange for continued assistance. The requirement wasn't punitive but rather recognition of his capacity for meaningful contribution. For the first time in his adult life, he experienced the satisfaction of earning gratitude through service rather than receiving pity through dysfunction. This simple recognition of his moral agency began a transformation that years of therapeutic intervention had failed to achieve. The solution isn't the elimination of all social assistance but rather its fundamental restructuring around principles that preserve rather than destroy human dignity. Genuine help would require contribution, impose standards, and accept that some people will choose not to meet reasonable expectations. This sounds harsh only to those who have confused sentimentalism with compassion. Effective assistance would recognize that the greatest gift we can give to struggling individuals isn't unconditional material support, but rather the opportunity to develop character through meeting challenges. The welfare system's assumption that people need to be protected from difficulty is actually a profound form of dehumanization that treats adults as children and transforms temporary assistance into permanent dependency. The transformation requires individual courage as much as policy reform. Parents must resist the temptation to shield their children from the consequences of poor choices. Employers must maintain standards even when it's easier to lower expectations. Communities must balance compassion with accountability, recognizing that true kindness sometimes requires saying no to immediate requests in service of long-term growth. Most importantly, we must recover the understanding that human beings require meaning more than comfort, purpose more than pleasure, and contribution more than consumption. The welfare state failed not because it was insufficiently generous but because it was insufficiently demanding. It provided everything except what people most desperately needed, the opportunity to earn their dignity through service to something greater than themselves. The psychological research confirms what common sense suggests. Individuals who contribute to their communities report higher levels of satisfaction and mental health than those who merely receive services. The welfare system had inverted this natural order, creating a class of permanent consumers rather than contributors, recipients rather than participants in the common good. Breaking free from the compassion trap requires the moral courage to expect more from people rather than less, to demand contribution rather than merely providing services, and to accept that genuine help sometimes involves temporary discomfort in service of permanent improvement. Conclusion. The welfare trap I observed wasn't created by malicious intent but by the systematic application of misguided compassion that confused kindness with enabling, help with harm, and dignity with dependency. After treating thousands of individuals caught within this system, I can state with clinical certainty that unconditional material provision destroys the human spirit more thoroughly than material hardship ever could. The tragedy isn't that we tried to help the disadvantaged, it's that we helped them in ways that guaranteed their continued disadvantage. By removing the connection between effort and reward, responsibility and consequence, we created a form of psychological slavery more complete than anything achieved by traditional poverty. We transformed temporary assistance into permanent dependency, individual problems into social grievances, and personal growth into therapeutic stagnation. The path forward requires the moral courage to impose high expectations precisely because we care about human dignity, not despite it. Genuine compassion demands that we treat struggling individuals as capable moral agents rather than permanent victims, as potential contributors rather than permanent consumers. This isn't cruelty disguised as kindness but rather kindness that refuses to disguise itself as enabling. The welfare recipients I met weren't lacking in intelligence, creativity, or potential. They were trapped in a system that systematically destroyed every character trait necessary for human flourishing. They deserved better than a society that expected nothing from them while providing everything for them. They deserved the opportunity to earn their dignity through contribution, to experience the satisfaction of overcoming difficulty through effort, and to discover that genuine security comes not from what others provide but from what we develop within ourselves. The welfare trap can be broken, but only by those with sufficient moral courage to choose the demanding path of genuine compassion over the comfortable illusion of sentimental enabling.